Hi and welcome to another episode of Pennsylvania Voter Information Network. Meet the Activist. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, and today we are here with Jenn Hallam. Also present is Amar Sajed. Jenn is an independent scholar and Emmy-nominated producer dedicated to work with historical and social impact. Whether studying visual culture, creating multimedia content, or engaging in political activism, Jenn's primary focus is on equal representation, equitable opportunity, and the freedom to self-determine. Her projects have covered such far-ranging subjects as portraits of early modern women, slavery and the making of America, childhood food insecurity, and trans-adolescent healthcare. She has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers University, and Philadelphia Community College, and worked for WNET, PBS, the History Channel, and Sesame Street, among others. Jenn, thank you for being a guest at Pennsylvania Voter Information Network.
Thanks very much for having me, Larry.
Jenn, before we get into some of the advocacy with the ACLU People Power Group, I'd love to hear more about your background. Tell us about some of this work.
Sure, absolutely. So I trained at the University of Pennsylvania, did a doctorate in art history, and during that time was focused primarily on issues of gender and representation. And by the time I finished my degree, I knew that I wanted to do something that put me out in the world a little bit more than in the ivory tower. And so I moved to New York to become a documentary filmmaker, and I started working at WNET, which is the PBS station there, on a 4-part project called Slavery and the Making of America. And I started as an unpaid intern, and I worked my way up, and I had a job within a couple of weeks, and have been doing work with WNET ever since then, more on the freelance end now. So the work that I wanted to go into was really work that would educate the widest possible audience that I could find, and so that was part of the allure of going into television, and from there doing work for web as well and video. And it was very important to me that all of the work that I did was socially responsible and was helping people to think critically about the world that we live in, as an art historian, to think critically about the visual world that we live in, the media that we consume. And so starting that work with Slavery and the Making of America and thinking about how African Americans have sort of helped to build the country that we now live on, and what that means, even going into the modern era that we're in now, was important to me. And eventually I worked my way through a number of different projects, and about 4 years ago I was working at Sesame Street, and I quit my job to make an independent film. And that independent film was about trans teens and their health care. It was something that was just starting to come out in the news, and you began to see a lot of these stories about trans kids not being able to use the bathrooms with the gender that they identify with. And I started to research it along with my film partner and talk to a number of medical providers about what they saw as being the primary issue, and they pointed us in the direction of teens and said these teens have one of the highest suicide rates in the nation, and we're really failing them. And so I said, this is worth quitting my job over. So I did, and I moved back home, and I've been working on that film since.
You're still in production for the trans one.
Post-production.
And where can we see Slavery and the Making of America?
You can actually look that up at pbs.org/slavery. There is a website that I also was the associate producer on, a really comprehensive website, and you should be able to find links there.
You have also done work regarding equal representation and equal opportunity. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. My scholarly work, and right now when I do that work, it is as an independent scholar, as you mentioned. And my main concern is about visual representation and the way that people form their identities and the way that they are perceived by others through visual representation. And so it's been very important to me to look at the way that women in particular have been portrayed over time, particularly with a focus on Western visuals, and because it does differ cross-culturally. And I've also worked on a series about cross-cultural art that gives you a different perspective into things, but about how women have been represented and how they've chosen to represent themselves, and the ways that how we represent women or other genders can really shape our social norms and our social expectations. And it's not just a passive reflection of the world around us. Images can be used to really shape the interactions that we have and even the policy that we create.
Tell us about some of the courses that you taught.
Sure, absolutely. I've taught your general art history survey courses, but I've also taught specific courses where I've had groups of students looking at social norms and how visual representations affect those, and the part that they play in shaping the society and the culture that we live in, even to the extent that it enters into politics. I've recently actually started doing a few workshops with local groups about art and protest and politics and what the intersection there is.
Fascinating. With what activist groups do you participate?
Sure. So right now I'm part of ACLU People Power with Upper Darby, and that's a group that I am the founding member of and I organize. I'm also part of HCAN, which is the Havertown Area Community Action Network, and I work with their women's issues group and also their arts advocacy group and their immigration group. They have a number of different working groups, and I'm a part of Upper Darby Indivisible as well.
You're both the leaders of the ACLU People Power Group. You're Chester County, Jen, you are Delaware County. And I understand that you are both members of Indivisible, correct?
I am a member of Indivisible.
You're not a member of Indivisible.
I'm on their mailing list.
And you participate in some events.
Yeah, I go to Way Forward, for example, is another one. Move On is another one that I go to.
Jen, this question is directed to you then.
Sure.
Compare and contrast any type of tenet or description of each group, Indivisible and ACLU, Power People, and actions of the groups.
Absolutely. So I think that with ACLU People Power, it's very much driven, and let me just stop and say that I don't consider myself to be a leader of the group so much as an organizer. So I want to make that distinction because
this is
I
a good
think
point.
It's important.
Sure.
And so I act as in an organizing capacity for our People Power group, but it's very much driven by a group in a democratic way. It's not.
Sure.
It's not hierarchical.
Now this is, and I don't mean to interrupt, but what you're talking about in terms of not hierarchical, this is the same thing that we have with Black Lives Matter. You have no head to cut off.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat of like a resistance type group. The idea is you're trying to fight for civil rights or tell truth to power, and therefore without a leader you don't have anyone who can be assassinated.
That's true.
That's good to know.
No, is that the idea?
You don't assassinate the organizer.
Well, you know what? Let me be less dramatic about this, but you don't have someone who could be arrested or can be intimidated into disbanding the group, and that's by design, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
So we would say we're organizers/hosts. Is basically the role we play.
Sure, you get rid of a host or organizer, you have someone else who's helping organize.
Exactly.
You're not going to get rid of, you're not going to slow down a group by taking one person and threatening one person, arresting one person. And that's the concept behind these civil rights groups.
Absolutely. And, without that designated leader, it's much more open to making decisions in which everyone's voice is heard. If I call myself the leader of the group and I say the buck stops here and I get to make the final decisions about what happens, then I'm potentially canceling out the voices of the other group members, and that's not how we want to operate.
Jen, we got a little distracted. Now tell me about the comparison and contrast to Indivisible and ACLU people power?
Sure. Well, as Amar was saying, ACLU People Power sort of grew out of ACLU, which is an established group that has been around for decades, that has been doing great work for years. And ACLU realized, particularly when the travel ban started and people were running to the airports and started to make more donations to ACLU and sign up to be members, they said, we've got all of this energy, and how can we help all of these people that want to get involved be a part of what we're doing, because they're not all lawyers and we can't hire them all. And so the ACLU's solution to that was, let's start this grassroots initiative, People Power, and say, we're doing this in the courts, you go do it in the streets. You know, that's what we've been doing ever since, is getting out into the streets and being that voice for civil rights and civil liberties.
And Indivisible?
And Indivisible started as really a resistance to the Trump agenda. So some former people that worked on congressional staff in DC started Indivisible as a guide. It was a guide to say, this is how you resist the Trump agenda. And the Trump agenda being an agenda that, as Amar was saying, sows hate and fear and tries to build walls and keep people out rather than building bridges that bring people together. And so Indivisible started really as a guide. It's literally a PDF that you can download online. And people started around the country forming these Indivisible groups of their own accord. And so the ACLU sort of handed down this mission and said to us, you know, here's your task, go to it. Indivisible was more of a groundswell of people saying, I want to get involved, and here's this document, and I'm going to take it and run with it. And what's been happening now is that a lot of the Indivisible groups realize that you can't just resist. You know, resistance only gets you so far. And so we need to stand up against these things that the Trump administration is doing, because they're bad for us as a society, because they are suppressive and oppressive to communities that have already been oppressed and suppressed. And so we do need to stand up for that, and we need to get out in the streets. We need to go to the airports. We need to go over to Thomas Paine Plaza, where I was heading this morning. But we also need to be fighting for something. You know, what do we stand for? And what's our vision of the world beyond Trump, right? We could resist for 4 years, and then what? And then where are we? And so a lot of the Indivisible groups that I've talked to, and I know for my own Indivisible group, what we're trying to think about now is, what is the world that we want to live in? What's this vision that we want to have of an inclusive, diverse society in which people take care of each other and understand that raising one person up raises everybody up? And we're thinking about ways to do that. And what does that policy look like? And what does that agenda look like? And how can we start to push that forward rather than just pushing against something?
So to summarize, ACLU People Power is generally, or was even generally formed to protect civil liberties generally. Yes. And Indivisible was narrowly tailored to resisting the Trump administration. And now, as they're in play for a year and a half, they are starting to blend.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, because in fact my People Power group and my Indivisible group have actually rolled into one another. And so my People Power group is now a branch of my Indivisible group, and we consider it to be the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties group, and also called our ACLU People Power group. But those two are completely in sync with one another. And the ACLU kind of mission tends to be more narrowly focused. And so when the ACLU first launched this initiative, they gave all of our groups the task of working on immigration issues. And so the call to action was, go and talk to your superintendents of your police forces or your sheriffs or whoever it is that does law enforcement, and find out what kinds of policies they're taking in their interactions with immigrant communities, and what are their interactions with ICE looking like. And so that was sort of the first mission. And then more recently, ACLU has rolled out this second mission, which is Let People Vote. And I believe we're going to be talking a little bit about the event that we're doing around Let People Vote.
Right. And you guys schedule really exciting events, I understand. Is that right?
Kick-ass events.
We try.
Very good. And you have one coming up, and I'd like to ask you about that, and I'm hoping that you can stay around after a short break.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. We are here with Jenn Hallam and Amir Sajed, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. We're going to take a short break. Please stay tuned. Thank you.